Who was the only disciple who stayed beside Jesus as he died on the cross? Why did Jesus choose him? Not Peter, not James, not any of the others, to care for his own mother. And how did a hot-tempered fisherman become the man remembered as the apostle of love? Stay with us until the end as we uncover the incredible story of John, the disciple whose life was transformed by simply staying close to Jesus. You're watching Jesus Tell Tales. Long before John became known as a beloved disciple, he was simply a fisherman on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He worked alongside his father, Zebedee, and his brother James. Their family-owned fishing boats, and every day was spent casting nets into the water, hoping for a good catch. It was an ordinary life, but God was preparing John for an extraordinary calling. One day, everything changed. A young teacher from Nazareth walked along the shore and called out two simple words, "Follow me." Without knowing where that invitation would lead, John left behind his nets, his boat, and the life he had always known. That single decision would change history forever. But don't imagine John as a gentle, humble man we often picture today. In the beginning, he was anything but gentle. Jesus gave John and his brother a surprising nickname, Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. It was a fitting name. John was passionate, impulsive, and quick to anger. On one occasion, a Samaritan village refused to welcome Jesus. Instead of showing mercy, John asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them?" He believed he was defending Jesus. Instead, Jesus gently corrected him. John still had much to learn. Like many people in Israel, John also dreamed of power and glory. He believed Jesus would soon establish an earthly kingdom, and he wanted one of the highest places in it. Together with his brother, he even asked Jesus if they could sit at his right and left when he became king. Jesus didn't reject him. He simply began changing him. Day after day, John watched Jesus do what no earthly king would ever do. He saw him touch lepers that everyone else avoided. He watched him forgive sinners instead of condemning them. He listened as Jesus welcomed children, comforted the broken, and served people who could offer him nothing in return. Slowly, something inside John began to change. His passion didn't disappear. It was transformed. The same fire that once wanted revenge began burning with compassion instead. As the months passed, John stayed closer to Jesus than almost anyone else. He witnessed miracles that few people ever saw. He stood on the mountain when Jesus was transfigured in dazzling glory. He watched Jairus' daughter rise from the dead. He listened as Jesus spoke about love, forgiveness, and laying down one's life for others. John wasn't simply learning lessons. He was watching love in action. Then came the final week. Jerusalem was crowded with pilgrims celebrating Passover. Jesus entered the city knowing the cross was waiting for him. John followed every step. He sat beside Jesus during the Last Supper. He watched as Jesus knelt and washed the disciples' feet like a servant. That night, they walked together into the Garden of Gethsemane. There, John saw something he had never seen before. Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow. He prayed with such agony that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. For the first time, John realized that following the Messiah would not lead to an earthly throne. It would first lead to a cross. Then everything happened so quickly. Judas arrived with soldiers. Jesus was arrested. The disciples panicked. One by one, they ran. John ran too. But somewhere between the garden and the courtroom, something changed. While most of the disciples disappeared into the darkness, John turned back. Because he was known to the high priest's household, he was allowed into the courtyard where Jesus was being questioned. He watched the false accusations. He watched the beatings. He watched the crown of thorns being pressed onto Jesus' head. And when Jesus was forced to carry his cross through the streets of Jerusalem, John followed. He stood at Golgotha while almost everyone else stayed away. When darkness covered the land, John stayed. When the crowds mocked Jesus, John stayed. When the soldiers gambled for his clothing, John stayed. He stood close enough to hear every final word spoken from the cross. Then, through his pain, Jesus looked down. Standing beside the cross was his mother, Mary. Next to her stood John. In one of the most tender moments in all of Scripture, Jesus looked at his mother and said, "Woman, behold your son." Then he looked at John. "Behold your mother." From that moment on, John took Mary into his own home. Jesus had entrusted his own mother to the one disciple who refused to leave him. But John had no idea that the greatest miracle he would ever witness was only 3 days away. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came running with astonishing news. "The tomb is empty." John and Peter immediately ran toward the garden. John was younger and reached the tomb first, but he stopped at the entrance. Peter rushed inside. Moments later, John stepped in and saw the linen clothes lying neatly where Jesus' body had been. The cloth that had covered his head was folded separately. This wasn't the scene of a robbery. Something extraordinary had happened. The Bible simply says, he saw and believed. John didn't yet understand everything about the resurrection, but in that quiet moment, faith began to replace grief. The cross had not been the end. Soon afterward, Jesus appeared to his disciples. The doors were locked because they feared the religious leaders. Yet suddenly Jesus stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." John saw the wounds in his hands. He saw the wound in his side. He heard the same voice that had called him from the shores of Galilee years before. The one who had died was now alive forever. Everything Jesus had promised was true. From that day on, John was no longer simply a follower of Jesus. He became one of his boldest witnesses. Years passed. The apostles carried the gospel across the world, preaching despite persecution, imprisonment, and suffering. One by one, they gave their lives for Christ. But John remained. He outlived every other apostle. As the years passed, he carried with him memories that no one else could share. He remembered leaning against Jesus during the Last Supper. He remembered standing beneath the cross. He remembered the empty tomb. These moments shaped every word he would later write. When John finally wrote his gospel, he didn't begin with the birth of Jesus. Instead, he took his readers back to eternity itself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John wanted the world to understand that Jesus was far more than a great teacher. He was God who had come to live among his people. Unlike the other gospel writers, John focused less on the number of miracles and more on what those miracles revealed. Turning water into wine showed that Jesus brings new life. Healing the blind man revealed that he is the light of the world. Raising Lazarus proved that he is the resurrection and the life. Every miracle pointed to one truth: Jesus is the Son of God. John also wrote letters to encourage the growing church. Again and again, he returned to one message: love one another. He had once wanted to call down fire from heaven. Now he spent his life teaching forgiveness, mercy, and love. Only someone completely transformed by Christ could make such a change. But John's journey wasn't over. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, Christians faced severe persecution. John was arrested and exiled to the rocky island of Patmos. Rome believed they had silenced the last surviving apostle. Instead, God gave him the greatest vision of his life. While worshipping on the Lord's Day, John suddenly heard a voice behind him like the sound of a trumpet. He turned and saw the glorified Christ. No longer the suffering servant standing before Pilate. No longer the teacher walking beside the Sea of Galilee. Now Jesus stood in heavenly glory, his face shining like the sun, his eyes blazing like fire. John immediately fell to the ground. Then Jesus spoke the words that have comforted believers for centuries. "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I was dead, and now I am alive forever and ever." Through those visions, John witnessed the throne of heaven, the worship of countless angels, the final victory over evil, and the promise of new heaven and a new earth where God would wipe away every tear. The disciple who had stood at the foot of the cross was now allowed to see the end of history itself. After his exile, John returned to Ephesus. By now he was an old man. His body had grown weak, but his faith had only become stronger. Church tradition says that when he was too old to preach long sermons, he would simply repeat the same words every time believers gathered. "Little children, love one another." Eventually, someone asked why he always said the same thing. John smiled and replied, "Because it is the Lord's command. If this alone is done, it is enough." Think about how incredible that transformation was. The young man who once asked Jesus to destroy a village with fire became the apostle who could not stop talking about love. The fisherman who dreamed of power became the disciple who served faithfully until the end. The son of thunder became the apostle of love. And perhaps that is John's greatest legacy. His greatest miracle wasn't the visions he received. It wasn't the gospel he wrote. It wasn't even the book of Revelation. His greatest miracle was the life that Jesus transformed. John stayed close to Christ. And over time, he became more like him. Maybe that's the lesson his life leaves for all of us. Real transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens by walking with Jesus every day, remaining faithful when life becomes difficult, and choosing love even when the world chooses hatred. Because in the end, John discovered something greater than power, greater than recognition, and greater than miracles. He discovered the very heart of Christ. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to Jesus Telltale for more inspiring Bible stories. And if you stayed with us until the end, write "love one another" in the comments below. We'll see you next time with another incredible journey through the pages of the Bible.